The sheriff's SUV rolled down the hill slow enough to spray gravel into the lake. Its light bar flashed across the water in blue bursts. Families near the clubhouse stopped talking. Music from the catering tent faded into nervous silence. Even the contractors backed away from the concrete hatch for a second. Sheriff Nolan Briggs stepped out, adjusting his belt like he had already decided how this conversation would end. I knew Briggs. Everybody around Lake Mercer knew Briggs. He spent more time at HOA fundraisers than patrol calls. The smell of hot brakes drifted off his cruiser while he walked toward me with one hand resting near his radio. "Morning, Ethan," he said. "Victoria tells me you are disrupting a private community event." I looked past him at the lake. That spillway gate was never supposed to be sealed. Briggs barely glanced at it. Victoria answered for him. "The engineers we hired approved everything." The nail gun started again behind her. Fast pops echoing over the water. Somebody laughed near the paddleboard racks. They had no idea what sat beneath that concrete. Briggs lowered his voice. "You have not lived here in years. Maybe let the community move forward." That line almost made me smile. I grew up on this shoreline. Learned to swim off that dock before I could ride a bike. My father built half the flood control systems around this county. And me? I spent 11 years designing emergency water diversion systems for the Army Corps of Engineers. Storm channels, spillways, overflow retention. Places where one bad decision turns a quiet neighborhood into a disaster report. The wind shifted across the lake, carrying the sharp smell of fresh concrete again. Too wet, too rushed. The crew had poured directly over the pressure release housing. I walked closer to the shoreline. Briggs moved with me immediately. "Do not cross the chain," he warned. "Or what?" He did not answer right away. Victoria did. "Or you will be arrested for trespassing." The words hung there for a second while waves tapped against the dock posts. Trespassing. On land my father paid taxes on for 37 years. A pontoon boat drifted near the center of the lake, dragging a huge Willowbrook Shores banner behind it. People onshore clapped when it passed. Victoria waved proudly like she had built the lake herself. Then I noticed the waterline. 6 inches higher than normal. Maybe 7. Not enough for anyone else to catch. Enough for me. The old cypress stump near the north bank was nearly covered. That only happened when pressure backed into the drainage tunnel. My stomach tightened. Not fear. Calculation. I looked uphill toward the subdivision. 36 homes sat above this basin. Expensive decks. Stone fire pits. Underground electrical vaults. All tied into one drainage corridor beneath the spillway controls they had just buried under concrete. Somebody in that HOA had ignored every warning label on the system. Or worse, removed them. Briggs saw me staring uphill. "This does not need to become a scene," he said quietly. But it already was. A contractor suddenly shouted from the hatch area. Wet concrete had started bubbling near the corner seam. Small bursts at first. Then darker water pushed through the surface in slow circles. One worker stepped back fast enough to lose his boot in the mud. Victoria's smile finally disappeared. I heard metal groan under the dock. Deep, heavy, familiar. That sound should not have been happening in dry weather. Then the emergency overflow alarm started ringing beneath the lake. The alarm echoed under the lake like a foghorn trapped beneath metal. Every head near the clubhouse snapped toward the dock. The bubbling concrete at the spillway hatch grew darker. Thick water pushed through the seams in uneven bursts. One contractor dropped his trowel and backed away fast enough to knock over a bucket. Victoria turned toward him sharply. "Finish the pour," she hissed. The guy just stared at the ground, vibrating beneath his boots. Sheriff Briggs finally looked uneasy. He stepped closer to the hatch while the alarm kept ringing in slow pulses. Not loud anymore. Worse, steady, mechanical, like something ancient had finally woken up under the lake. I could smell overheated motors now. Burnt dust, wet steel. The emergency pressure pumps were trying to force water through a blocked release tunnel. Briggs crouched near the bubbling concrete. "Can you shut this thing off?" he asked me quietly. Victoria answered before I could speak. He is not authorized to touch HOA infrastructure. I looked at her for a long second. HOA infrastructure. The woman had buried a county flood control gate under wet concrete and turned it into a neighborhood amenity. A sharp crack snapped through the dock behind us. Several people near the shoreline stumbled backward. One of the support beams shifted half an inch sideways into the mud. Small movement. Huge problem. The lake level kept rising. You could see it now if you knew where to look. Water crept higher against the old cedar posts. Foam gathered near the drainage culvert beside the clubhouse. Nobody at the party understood what they were watching. Kids still chased each other near the paddleboards. A bartender carried trays of champagne glasses across the deck. Somebody restarted the music for about 5 seconds before another groan rolled beneath the shoreline and shut everybody up again. I walked uphill toward the culvert while Briggs followed me. The gravel path felt soft under my boots. Saturated already. That should not happen in midsummer. The drainage corridor beneath the subdivision had nowhere to release pressure now. Water was backing into the retention system, straight toward Willowbrook Shores. I crouched beside the culvert opening. Fresh concrete chunks floated inside muddy runoff. One piece still had red paint on it from the old hatch warning labels. Somebody had smashed the markers before pouring. Victoria came marching up the hill behind us. Her heels sank into wet ground with every step. "You were trying to scare people," she snapped. "This lake has been neglected for years." I stood up slowly. "That tunnel was inspected every spring." "By who?" she shot back. "By me." The words landed harder than I expected. Briggs looked at me differently after that. Not like some angry property owner anymore. Like a man standing beside machinery he did not understand. Another deep vibration rolled through the ground. This time stronger. Glasses rattled on tables near the clubhouse patio. Somewhere uphill, a car alarm suddenly chirped too. "Life." One of the contractors jogged toward us breathing hard. Sweat streaked down the dust on his face. "Ma'am," he told Victoria. "The lower pump room is flooding." Silence hit the shoreline. Even the lake seemed still for a second. Then everybody heard it. Water rushing somewhere beneath their feet. Fast. Heavy. Hidden inside the hill under 36 expensive homes. Victoria's face finally lost color. Briggs reached for his radio. I looked uphill toward the subdivision roads disappearing between rows of lakefront houses. Then the first storm siren started spinning across the county. The storm siren kept spinning over the county while people started leaving the shoreline in nervous clusters. Car doors slammed uphill. Golf carts bounced across wet grass. The luxury lake party dissolved in less than 2 minutes. Victoria stood frozen near the clubhouse patio, gripping her phone so hard her knuckles turned pale. Sheriff Briggs barked orders into his radio while deputies moved residents away from the waterline. Nobody was smiling anymore. The lake had changed color. Darker now. Murky pressure rolling beneath the surface in slow, uneven swells. I walked past the catering tables toward the old maintenance path beside the shoreline. Wet pine needles stuck to my boots. The air smelled like rain even though the sky was still clear. That was the problem with flood systems. Most people thought danger arrived with storms. Real failures started underground long before the clouds showed up. Briggs caught up beside me, breathing harder than before. "Tell me exactly what happens if that tunnel backs up." I looked toward the subdivision hill. "Water has nowhere to discharge." Meaning every drainage line uphill starts filling in reverse. A sharp metallic bang echoed from beneath the clubhouse deck. Several people screamed near the parking area. One of the decorative stone planters tipped sideways as muddy water pushed through cracks in the pavement below it. Victoria hurried toward us. Her heels were gone now, bare feet blackened with mud. "Fix it," she snapped at me. Not a request. Not even panic yet. Just entitlement cracking around the edges. "Open the gate." "You." Sealed the controls under concrete. "Then break it open." I stared at her for a second. The same woman who chained my dock 3 hours earlier now wanted access to the system she called HOA property. The irony almost distracted me from the sound underneath us. Water hammer. rapid pressure impacts inside confined drainage pipes, deep thuds rolling under the hill like distant construction blasts. I had heard that sound before during a flood control failure outside Tulsa. 20 homes ended up underwater there. Briggs heard it too this time. His face tightened immediately. Another deputy jogged downhill toward us. "Sheriff," he shouted. "Basement flooding reported on Cedar Ridge Drive." That was uphill. Way uphill. Too fast for normal runoff. Briggs looked at me again. Really looked this time. "Can you stop it?" "Maybe." Victoria stepped closer. Mascara streaked slightly at the corners of her eyes now. "Then do it." I pointed toward the concrete-covered hatch. "That needs to come off before pressure destroys the lower channels." The contractor foreman overheard us and shook his head instantly. "We poured quickset mix," he said. 6-hour cure minimum. I crouched beside the shoreline and dipped my hand into the water. Warmer than it should have been. Turbulent underneath. The release pumps were overheating, which meant the emergency bypass valves had probably activated already. If those failed too, the lower retention corridor beneath Willowbrook Shores would flood from inside the hill outward. Not dramatic. Worse. Silent. Expensive. A low rumble rolled across the subdivision again. This time everybody heard it clearly. Porch lights flickered uphill even though it was still daytime. Then several sprinklers near the clubhouse suddenly exploded upward with muddy brown water spraying across the lawns. Residents started shouting over each other. Somebody slipped near the parking lot and dropped an entire tray of champagne glasses into the mud. Victoria looked uphill toward the homes she had been selling as premium lakefront property all summer. The first window alarm started screaming from somewhere above us. Then another answered farther up the hill. Briggs slowly lowered his radio from his mouth. "This is getting bigger," he muttered. Then my phone started vibrating with calls from numbers I recognized. My phone would not stop vibrating. County Emergency Management. Public Works. 2 engineers I had not spoken to in years. Even the old marina supervisor from Mercer Landing was calling. I stepped away from the shoreline noise and answered the first one. "Ethan?" The voice snapped immediately. "Why are pressure alarms triggering under Willowbrook?" I looked uphill at residents dragging luggage out of garages while muddy water crept beneath parked SUVs. "Because somebody sealed the lower release gate." Silence hit the line for half a second. Then I heard papers shuffling fast. "That gate feeds the entire north retention corridor." "I know." Another alarm started screaming uphill. Different tone this time. Home security systems. More residents flooded onto driveways holding phones and shouting at each other. The peaceful luxury neighborhood Victoria spent 2 years building now sounded like a ship taking on water. Briggs motioned me toward his cruiser. "Talk," he said. Rain clouds had finally started gathering above the lake. Thick gray bands sliding across the hills from the west. Wind pushed cold air across the shoreline hard enough to rattle the patio umbrellas beside the clubhouse. I leaned against the hood of the SUV and looked at the subdivision map displayed on Briggs' dashboard tablet. The entire drainage grid spread across the screen in thin blue lines. Every one of them pointed back toward the spillway tunnel they buried. "Who approved the modifications?" I asked. Briggs rubbed one hand across his jaw. "Victoria's development committee handled most of it." "That is not what I asked." He looked away after that, which was answer enough. A deputy suddenly shouted from uphill. Water was pouring out of a retaining wall beside Cedar Ridge Drive. Not over it. Through it. Dirty brown streams pushed between the stone seams while residents stood in their yards filming with their phones. One woman screamed when part of the landscaping collapsed into the runoff channel below. Victoria marched toward us carrying a stack of soaked papers against her chest. Her expensive white blouse was streaked with mud now. "The county signed off on every permit," she snapped. I took the papers from her before she could stop me. Architectural approvals. Landscaping revisions, dock permits, event licensing, everything except the one document that actually mattered. Flood control authorization. It was missing completely. I looked up slowly. "You built all this without hydraulic clearance?" The consultants said it was unnecessary. What consultants? She opened her mouth, closed it again. That told me everything. Somewhere beneath the subdivision, another deep impact rolled through the ground. Hard enough this time to shake dirt from the clubhouse roofline. Several residents backed away from the building immediately. Briggs grabbed his radio again. "Evacuate lower lake properties," he ordered. "Now." That changed the mood instantly. Panic moved faster than water. Engines started revving uphill. Garage doors rattled open all across Willowbrook Shores. The smell of wet asphalt filled the air as people tried leaving at once. Then headlights stopped moving. A deputy near the entrance road shouted something I could not hear over the sirens. Briggs turned sharply toward him. "What now?" The deputy pointed downhill toward the main access road. Water had started bubbling through the storm drains there too. Thick muddy surges rolling across the pavement in uneven bursts. The only exit from the subdivision sat directly over the overloaded lower channel. Victoria stared at the road with both hands covering her mouth now. "That cannot happen," she whispered. But I knew exactly what was happening. The retention system was reversing direction beneath the hill. And if the pressure kept climbing, the next failure would not stay underground. Then lightning flashed over the lake for the first time. Lightning flashed again across Lake Mercer, turning the water silver for half a second. Then thunder rolled over the hills hard enough to vibrate through the dock posts. Residents were abandoning the clubhouse now. Cars jammed the curved subdivision roads while deputies tried directing traffic away from the flooded entrance lane. Nobody moved fast. Too many luxury trucks. Too many people panicking at once. Muddy water surged through the storm drains in violent bursts now, spraying across the pavement like broken fire hydrants. Sheriff Briggs slammed his cruiser door and pointed at me. "Tell me what fixes this." Rain started falling before I answered. Big cold drops hitting the hood of the SUV. "The release gate has to open." Victoria stepped under the awning beside the clubhouse entrance. Her makeup was streaked from the rain and humidity now. She looked smaller suddenly, less like a neighborhood queen and more like someone realizing the walls around her were made of paper. "Then open it," she shouted over the wind. "You buried it under 4,000 pounds of quickset concrete." I shot back. Another deep boom rolled beneath the hill, this one stronger than before. Porch lights flickered again across Willowbrook Shores. Then half the subdivision went dark. A line transformer somewhere uphill snapped with a sharp electric crack. Residents screamed when entire sections of the street lost power at once. Rain hammered harder against the pavement now. The smell of ozone mixed with wet dirt and lake water. Briggs grabbed my shoulder. "Can the system survive the storm?" I looked toward the shoreline. Water was already pushing over the lower retaining stones beside the marina path. "Not if pressure keeps building." One of the deputies ran toward us through ankle-deep runoff. "Sheriff, we got water inside the utility vault under Cedar Ridge." Briggs cursed under his breath. That vault controlled underground electrical lines for half the neighborhood. Once water reached the transformers, everything downhill would fail next. I moved toward the old maintenance shed near the dock while Briggs followed close behind. Victoria hesitated for 1 second before trailing us through the rain. The shed smelled like wet rope and rusted fuel cans. Most of the original tools were still there. My father kept backups for everything, even emergency release keys. I yanked open a steel cabinet bolted into the wall. Empty. The mounting brackets inside had fresh scrape marks. Someone had removed the manual override crank recently. Victoria saw it too. "What is missing?" she asked. I looked at her. The only tool capable of opening the bypass gate manually. Her face drained again. Briggs turned sharply. "Who had access to this building?" Victoria hesitated. Tiny pause. "But enough." "The renovation contractors," she admitted quietly. Outside, another siren started wailing from uphill. This one different. Not weather. Fire rescue. We stepped back into the storm. Rain slashed sideways across the lake now. The waterline had climbed nearly another foot. Waves hammered the dock hard enough to send spray over the walkway chains. A county emergency truck finally arrived near the marina entrance with flashing amber lights cutting through the rain. 2 engineers jumped out carrying equipment cases. I recognized one immediately. Frank Delaney, Senior Flood Systems Inspector. Gray beard, orange rain jacket. Same man who trained me 15 years earlier. Frank took one look at the bubbling spillway hatch and stopped cold. Who sealed that gate? Nobody answered. Frank slowly removed his glasses and wiped rainwater from them. Do these people understand what sits underneath this subdivision? Briggs looked toward me. Victoria did not. She just stared uphill where water was now pouring across driveways in steady brown streams. Frank crouched beside the concrete cap while rainwater hissed across the surface. Then he looked up at me with an expression I had not seen since my Army Corps days. Pure professional concern. Ethan, he said quietly, pressure readings are climbing faster than the models predicted. Rain hammered the lake hard enough to blur the shoreline lights into smears of yellow and white. Frank Delaney stayed crouched beside the sealed spillway hatch with one hand pressed against the vibrating concrete. Water hissed through tiny cracks around the edges now, not leaking anymore, forcing its way out. Sheriff Briggs stood beside him holding a flashlight while deputies pushed residents farther uphill. Nobody argued with them now. The subdivision roads looked like rivers under the storm runoff. I knelt beside Frank and felt the vibration myself. Constant. Heavy. Wrong. Pressure chambers are overloaded, Frank muttered. The bypass valves should have released 20 minutes ago. Victoria stood 10 feet away in the rain with both arms wrapped around herself. Her phone kept ringing. She ignored every call. The clubhouse behind her had gone dark except for emergency exit lights glowing red through the windows. Rainwater poured off the roof in thick sheets. Can we cut through the concrete? Briggs asked. Frank shook his head immediately. Not fast enough. Another deep impact rolled beneath the hill. This one cracked pavement near the marina entrance. Residents screamed as muddy water burst upward through the asphalt in a violent spray. A parked golf cart tilted sideways into the runoff channel beside the road. Briggs grabbed his radio again. Move everybody to higher ground now. The county engineers unloaded portable pressure monitors from their truck and spread maps across the hood under flashing amber lights. I recognized the numbers before Frank even said them aloud. We are nearing structural overload. Victoria finally stepped closer. Rain soaked her hair flat against her face now. Explain that in English. Frank stood slowly. If pressure keeps climbing, the lower tunnel walls fail. And, Frank pointed uphill toward Willowbrook Shores. And the hill starts draining from the inside. Silence hit after that. Even the deputies stopped moving for a second. Everybody understood those words. Water started spilling over the marina walkway behind us. Fast now. Not waves. Flow. The lake itself was rising into the property. One of the engineers suddenly called my name from the truck. Ethan, you need to see this. I jogged through ankle-deep runoff toward the monitors. The screen showed pressure spikes racing through the lower drainage channels in sharp red lines. One section flashed continuously beneath Cedar Ridge Drive. That line should not be active, I said immediately. Frank joined me beside the monitor. It was not on the county schematics. Victoria froze when she heard that. I turned toward her slowly. What else did your contractors build down there? Her eyes shifted away for the first time since this started. Tiny movement, but enough. Briggs noticed it too. Victoria, he said sharply. Answer him. Rain pounded against the truck roof while she hesitated. Then came the words nobody wanted to hear. We expanded the lower drainage corridor for the new homes. Frank stared at her in disbelief. Without federal review? The developers said it would increase shoreline value. Another rumble exploded beneath the subdivision. Strong enough this time to knock dirt from the retaining wall beside the marina path. Several residents uphill started shouting and pointing toward Cedar Ridge. I followed their eyes. One section of roadway had begun sinking in the center. Slowly at first, then faster. Streetlights flickered over rain-soaked pavement while muddy water pushed through widening cracks across the road surface. Briggs cursed under his breath. That road sits directly above the lower tunnel, I said. Frank looked at the collapsing pavement for one long second. Then he turned toward me. If that corridor caves in, the entire retention basin releases uphill. Lightning flashed across the lake again. This time nobody looked away from the road. The road buckled with a sound like a tree splitting in half. Asphalt folded downward near the center of Cedar Ridge Drive, while muddy water blasted through the widening crack underneath it. Residents stumbled backward screaming as chunks of pavement slid into the collapsing trench below. Sheriff Briggs started pulling people uphill immediately. Deputies ran door to door through the rain, pounding on houses with flashlights and radios. The entire subdivision had gone into survival mode. I stood beside Frank, watching the roadway sink another foot. Water churned violently beneath the opening now. Brown. Fast. Full pressure. Frank wiped rain from his beard and looked at me. The lower corridor is gone. Another section of curb collapsed into the trench beside a parked SUV. Car alarms echoed through the storm while runoff surged downhill toward the marina. Victoria stared at the destruction with both hands trembling at her sides. The woman who spent 2 years selling this neighborhood as exclusive waterfront luxury suddenly looked completely lost. "How many homes are affected?" she asked quietly. Frank did not soften the answer. "All of them." Lightning flashed again across the lake. The shoreline behind us looked almost unrecognizable now. Water had swallowed half the marina walkway. The decorative HOA banners floated loose near the dock chains. One of the paddleboard racks tipped sideways and disappeared into the dark water. Then the power failed completely. Every remaining house light uphill vanished at once. The subdivision dropped into darkness except for emergency strobes, deputy flashlights, and the spinning red glow of rescue vehicles arriving from town. Rain hammered metal rooftops so hard it sounded like static filling the entire valley. Briggs pointed toward the shoreline. "What happens next?" I looked at the lake-level markers beside the old dock. "The retention basin equalizes." Victoria shook her head immediately. "I do not know what that means." "It means the water takes its space back." Nobody spoke after that. The lake answered for me. A deep roar rolled through the lower basin as another underground wall failed beneath Willowbrook Shores. Water burst through the marina retaining wall in 3 separate places. Not explosive. Worse. Steady. Relentless. Thick currents poured across the lower parking lot carrying mud, branches, and broken landscaping lights into the street. Residents rushed uphill carrying pets, backpacks, and plastic storage bins through knee-deep runoff. Frank grabbed the county maps from the truck hood before the rain destroyed them completely. "The expanded corridor redirected pressure straight under the subdivision," he muttered. "Those developers turned a flood release system into buildable property." Briggs looked at Victoria sharply. "Who approved that expansion?" She opened her mouth, but another voice answered first. "I did." Everybody turned toward the black SUV pulling into the marina lot through floodwater. A heavy-set man stepped out holding an umbrella against the rain. Expensive coat. Expensive shoes. Developer smile already collapsing under the situation around him. I recognized him immediately. Grant Mercer. Lead developer for Willowbrook Shores. Victoria looked ready to faint. Mercer ignored the flooding around him and walked straight toward Frank. "This can be stabilized," he said quickly. Frank stared at him like he had just confessed to dynamiting a dam. "You built residential foundations over a federal retention corridor." Mercer glanced toward me then. Tiny flicker of recognition. "You are Ethan Cole. You should have called before touching my lake." Another violent crack rolled uphill. Several residents screamed again as part of a backyard retaining wall collapsed behind the darkened houses. Mercer finally looked toward the subdivision for the first time since arriving. His expression changed instantly. Not panic yet. Calculation. The kind men get when they realize lawsuits are coming. Then Frank handed Briggs the pressure report. Frank held the pressure report against the hood of the county truck while rainwater streamed off the paper in thin rivers. Even through the storm, the numbers were clear enough to change the entire atmosphere around us. He looked up slowly, voice lower than before. If we do nothing, the system will continue equalizing until the entire lower basin stabilizes through uncontrolled overflow. Briggs stared at him. In English, Frank did not blink. It means the lake will find every exit it can, including residential streets. A long silence followed, broken only by rain hitting metal and distant alarms still echoing uphill. Mercer finally stepped forward again, trying to reclaim control of the moment. "We can reinforce the corridor," he said quickly. "Bring in emergency crews, shore up the walls, redirect flow." Frank cut him off. "You are past reinforcement." Mercer's expression tightened for the first time. Victoria stood behind him, completely soaked now, staring at the flooded marina like it had betrayed her personally. I walked back toward the old maintenance shed without speaking. Briggs followed immediately. Frank did too. The shed door was still hanging slightly open from earlier. Inside, water had already started creeping across the floorboards. I moved directly to the locked cabinet again. This time I found what had been missing: the manual override. Crank had been left behind inside a secondary storage compartment wedged behind old survey equipment. Briggs watched as I pulled it free. "That opens the bypass gate?" he asked. I nodded. Frank stepped closer. "That gate has not been operated manually in over 10 years. I wiped rain off the metal handle. Then it is overdue." Victoria appeared in the doorway behind us, breathing hard. "If you open anything without approval, you will flood the lower properties." I looked at her once. "The lower properties are already flooding." Another deep vibration rolled through the ground beneath the shed. This one felt closer. Frank checked his tablet again and his face changed. "Pressure surge is accelerating." Mercer's voice echoed from outside. "This is liability disaster," he shouted through the rain. "We need to stabilize immediately." Briggs turned toward him. "Stabilize what? You built houses on top of a failing drainage system." Mercer ignored him and pointed at me. "Do not let him touch that gate." That was the first time Victoria did not back him up. I stepped out into the rain with the crank in my hand. The maintenance path down to the spillway was partially underwater now. Water moving uphill in thin sheets across the concrete slope. Frank stayed beside me while Briggs coordinated evacuation routes through his radio. Residents were now moving in organized groups toward higher ground. No shouting, just urgency. Mercer followed a few steps behind, still talking into his phone about emergency engineering teams and insurance mitigation. Nobody was listening to him anymore. We reached the spillway access point where the concrete cap had been poured. The surface was already fractured, thin lines of water forcing their way through stress points. I knelt beside the edge and found the manual access panel partially exposed beneath broken cement. Frank stared at it. "If that opens too fast, you will shock the system." "It is already shocked," I replied. Victoria arrived behind us, stopping at the edge of the slope. For the first time, she did not speak, just watched. I inserted the crank into the emergency shaft. Metal caught metal with a heavy lock sound. The entire hillside seemed to hold its breath. Even the rain felt quieter for a second. Briggs raised his radio but did not speak. Frank stepped back slightly. "Slow rotation," he said. "Let the system breathe." I started turning the crank. At first nothing happened. Then a deep mechanical release echoed beneath the lake. Not loud, controlled, like something enormous finally unlocking after years of pressure. Water movement shifted direction beneath our feet. The violent surges from earlier began to stabilize into steady flow. Frank checked his monitor and exhaled slowly. "Pressure is dropping." Mercer stood frozen behind us, watching the hillside instead of his phone now. Victoria sank to her knees in the mud beside the slope, staring at the runoff channel as it finally behaved the way it was designed to. Briggs lowered his radio. "Evacuation is holding." The lake behind us began to settle, waves losing their violent rhythm and returning to slow, uneven ripples across the surface. Distant sirens faded one by one as emergency crews confirmed structural stabilization across Willowbrook Shores. Frank looked at me one last time. "That system was one decision away from failure," he said quietly. I kept my hand on the crank until the last vibration disappeared beneath the ground. Then I released it. The lake went still again.